we are going to break down the Eastern Front of World War II through 8 key elements, comparing the Soviet Red Army and the military of Nazi Germany. Brains. The German army entered Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, not only with overwhelming military might, but they were also heavily driven by the ideology of Lebensraum, living space. Combined with a deep-seated belief in the absolute superiority of the Aryan race and a historic mission to eradicate the Bolshevik threat, the Nazi war machine possessed an incredibly brutal offensive momentum. During those first few months, the morale of Wehrmacht soldiers hit an absolute peak. Their previous streak of lightning-fast victories, Blitzkrieg, in the west, along with massive encirclements that annihilated countless Soviet divisions right at the border, reinforced the illusion of an invincible army, and a campaign that would wrap up swiftly before the snow even started to fall. However, as the quick victory strategy began to fail, those ideological dogmas started fracturing against the harsh reality of the battlefield. The sheer mind-boggling geographical distances, the exhausting muddy season, Rasputitsa, and the unforgiving Russian winter completely paralyzed their logistics networks. Coupled with the fierce resistance of the defenders and a guerrilla warfare movement draining their lifeblood in the rear, German casualties skyrocketed. Facing bone-chilling cold, starvation, and death constantly lurking in a foreign land, the German soldiers' belief in their historic mission or racial superiority gradually gave way to extreme exhaustion, deep skepticism, and outright despair. In stark contrast, the Soviet Red Army stepped into this brutal crucible with the grand mindset of the Great Patriotic War. For them, this wasn't a war fought for ideological or territorial expansion. It was a life-or-death resistance to protect the very survival of an entire nation. The sheer brutality of the fascist forces in occupied territories eliminated any thought of retreat, fanning the flames of a profound and burning hatred for the enemy. Soviet soldiers fought with the absolute realization that right behind them was their homeland, their parents, and their wives and children who were directly facing the threat of genocide or permanent enslavement. This fierce survival instinct forged an extraordinary level of endurance, helping them push far past all human limits. It stands as a testament to their iron will during the defensive campaign of Moscow in 1941, the immortal resilience of the civilians during the 900-day siege of Leningrad, or the spirit of holding on to every single inch of rubble in the meat grinder of Stalingrad. Even while fighting through severely depleted logistics in the early stages and suffering the most horrific human losses in human history, patriotism and the collective desire to survive became their ultimate invisible weapon. It was precisely this immense spiritual strength that helped the Red Army rise above the darkness of despair, turn the tide, and secure the final victory scoreboard. Military doctrine and tactics. Brawn. The German army applied the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, strategy which had been the key to their resounding victories in Western Europe. In places with limited geographical distances and well-developed road infrastructure, the seamless coordination between deep armored thrusts, panzers, motorized infantry, and overwhelming air support easily shattered any defensive line. In the early months of 1941, Blitzkrieg unleashed its terrifying power, helping the Germans advance thousands of kilometers deep into Soviet territory and encircle and destroy millions of Red Army soldiers. However, the Soviet Union was an entirely different kind of battlefield. Across a vast territory with complex terrain, from the dense taiga forests and sprawling swamps to the endless steppes, Blitzkrieg met its ultimate nemesis, space and weather. The poor transportation system, combined with the mud phenomenon, Rasputitsa, in the autumn and spring, stretched and paralyzed their logistical lines. Blitzkrieg was inherently designed to end wars quickly. So when the Red Army didn't collapse after the initial stunning blows, Germany was dragged into a war of attrition where their offensive momentum simply couldn't be sustained. On the flip side, the Red Army possessed a much more macro-level strategic vision, the deep battle doctrine. Proposed by brilliant military theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky in the 1930s, this doctrine didn't seek victory through isolated single battles. Its goal was to neutralize the enemy's entire military system by attacking simultaneously across the entire operational depth, from the first defensive line and reserve assembly areas to supply routes, and all the way back to rear facilities. Despite paying an incredibly high price between 1941 and 1942 due to a lack of combat experience and command blunders, the Red Army powerfully transformed themselves thanks to their capacity to learn and the backing of a colossal industrial base evacuated behind the Ural Mountains. By 1943, this doctrine entered its refinement phase, reaching its grand pinnacle during Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1944. Combined with exceptional military deception, maskirovka, the Red Army tore the front wide open, using tank armies as spearheads to thrust deep, completely cutting off and annihilating almost the entirety of the German army group center. If Blitzkrieg was a masterpiece of quick-strike tactics, deep battle was the ultimate operational mindset for total war. It was geographical depth itself that broke the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, setting the stage for the deep battle machine to rise, kicking off the era of comprehensive counteroffensives and ultimately bringing down the Third Reich. Infantry, small arms, firepower. People often hear a lot about the brilliance of German engineering during World War II, right? If you hold a Kar 98K rifle or an MP40 submachine gun in your hands, you'll see they are almost like works of art. The machining process was incredibly exquisite, boasting high precision and manufacturing quality that was truly flawless. In training conditions or ideal environments, they delivered outstanding performance. But the reality is, war doesn't take place in a laboratory, and the Eastern Front was a completely different nightmare. Just picture this. Soldiers had to crawl through the relentless mud of Russia, and then winter struck with temperatures plummeting below 30 degrees Celsius. At this point, the very complexity and tight tolerances of German weapons backfired. Lubricating oil thickened into glue, and dirt seeped into the mechanical parts, causing the guns to jam constantly. Disassembly or maintenance required precise components and a relatively clean environment, a luxury that was practically non-existent in the trenches. Meanwhile, the mindset of the Soviet Red Army took an entirely pragmatic approach. They didn't build the PPSH-41 submachine gun to put it in an exhibition or a competition. It was a weapon of total war, a crude design, super simple construction, mostly made from stamped metal to drive production costs down to the absolute minimum. The most crucial criterion was that it could be mass-produced at breakneck speeds by any wartime industrial assembly line. Best of all, it was unbelievably rugged. Whether it was tossed in the mud or frozen under the snow, it still functioned smoothly, and when it came to fierce urban warfare like in Stalingrad, the PPSH-41 truly shined. Amidst the rubble, in cramped underground bunkers where both sides fought tooth and nail at distances of just a few meters, its massive 71-round drum magazine and a blistering fire rate of 900 rounds per minute turned this gun into a literal sweeping machine. That stubborn reliability and continuous, overwhelming firepower gave the Soviet soldier the total edge in close-quarters combat, completely making up for the technological gap. Clearly, this war proved one absolute truth. The best weapon isn't the most exquisitely crafted one. It's the one that still chambers around and fires when you need it the most. 4. Weather and adaptation. You know, whenever the Eastern Front of World War II is mentioned, people love to romanticize the power of General Winter, as if nature only favored and took the side of the Soviet Union. But what's the real story? Snowstorms, mud and frost don't know how to distinguish friend from foe. Both the German and Red armies had to endure the exact same brutal weather conditions. Bone-chilling cold that dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, the sticky Rasputitsa mud seasons that swallowed whole vehicles, or the blindingly dusty heat of summer. The vital difference here wasn't the weather itself, but rather the mindset of preparation and the ability to adapt. Let's take a look at the German side. They marched into the war with excessive confidence, fully believing that with their Blitzkrieg tactics, everything would be wrapped up smoothly in just a few weeks, definitely before the snow fell. And then reality dealt them a fatal blow. When the winter of 1941 crashed down, the massive Nazi war machine was suddenly paralyzed. Lubricating oils thickened into glue, turning their sophisticated guns into useless lumps of iron. Thousands of expensive tanks and trucks stalled out and were simply abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The most tragic fate befell the German soldiers, shivering in their flimsy summer uniforms. They became so desperate that they had to loot pieces of clothing and blankets from civilians just to survive the freezing cold. Conversely, the Soviet Red Army was fighting on their own home turf, and they understood the harsh rules of this land all too well. They didn't try to fight nature, they adapted to it. Instead of using regular socks which easily get wet and cause frostbite in the snow, Soviet soldiers used portyanki, a traditional foot wrap that provided top-tier insulation and was incredibly easy to dry. On the surface, a Red Army soldier might have looked clunky with their bulky sheepskin tulip coat and Ushanka fur hat covering their ears, but those were the very talismans that kept them alive. And it wasn't just the men, the machines were meticulously prepared too. They utilized specialized anti-freeze fuel and lubricants, ensuring their T-34 tanks kept roaring to life, no matter the blizzard. Thanks to that methodical preparation, while the German forces were completely frozen in their tracks, the Red Army maintained astonishing mobility and firepower. The brutal winter transformed from a common enemy into a potent weapon, helping the Russians turn the tide in this life-or-death struggle. Command structures. When analyzing the Eastern Front, we often dissect firepower or the brutality of the weather. But guys, there is one vital element that was far more decisive than all of that: the brains of the command structure. Interestingly enough, during the early stages of the war, both Germany and the Soviet Union suffered from the same fatal flaw: the overly deep interference of politicians in military combat decisions. If you look at the Red Army in 1941, it was an absolute disaster. The brutal pre-war purges had wiped out an entire generation of experienced officers, leaving a massive void in capability. On top of that, Stalin, with his rigid approach, micromanaged and meddled in every single move. The consequence: millions of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured in a deeply frustrating manner. On the flip side, although the German army initially won victory after victory, their command apparatus had already started to crack. Hitler increasingly loved to dabble in tactics, which, combined with the underlying culture of competition among army group commanders, often caused their coordination to fall into a state of the right hand not knowing what the left was doing. However, the strategic turning point of the entire war on the chessboard emerged in 1942. The key here was a shift in mindset. After bitter stumbles, Stalin finally accepted a hard truth: he was not a military genius. And so he began to step back, easing his grip and boldly delegating battlefield decision-making to true strategic minds like Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Konstantin Rokossovsky. The Soviet command structure was completely transformed. They became more professional and pragmatic, learning how to seamlessly coordinate different branches of the military, and most importantly, they knew how to draw blood-soaked lessons from their own failures. While Stalin knew exactly when to let go of power, Hitler took an entirely opposite turn. The deeper they bogged down, the more paranoid the German Führer became, hoarding all authority. He sidelined brilliant generals and deeply interfered in minor tactical decisions with incredibly rigid and irrational stand-or-die orders. The flexible German command system that once dominated all of Europe suddenly became stiff and paralyzed. Clearly, the outcome of this war wasn't solely decided by artillery firepower or tanks, but also by how the leaders utilized their people. It was precisely this monumental shift in the art of command that helped the Red Army rise from the mud, flipping the board from a desperate defensive stance to storm-like counteroffensives, ultimately deciding the fate of an entire war. The role of women. Have you ever noticed that when a nation is pushed to the brink of annihilation, how they utilize their human resources perfectly reflects their core ideology? During World War II, the stark contrast in how Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union viewed the role of women is a glaringly sharp testament to this. Just look at Germany. Under the Nazi regime, a woman's destiny was nailed to an incredibly conservative slogan: Kinder, Küche, meaning children, kitchen, and church. Their ideology viewed women purely as the keepers of the family flame, bearing the mission to breed future generations of warriors for the Reich. Even by 1942, when the German army was suffering massive casualties on the Eastern Front and manpower shortages hit red alert, the Nazi top brass adamantly refused to let women into the war effort. At most, they were assigned to desk jobs, rearguard logistics, or reluctantly placed on industrial assembly lines. This conservatism indirectly stripped Germany of half its national strength. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union held a completely opposite mindset. Thanks to the foundation of gender equality policies deeply ingrained in society since the 1920s and 30s, the moment the flames of war spread, the Red Army instantly activated a total national defense mode. Soviet women didn't just stay in the rear as nurses or liaison officers. Not at all. Over 800,000 women directly donned military uniforms, picked up rifles, and marched straight to the front lines. And battlefield realities prove they fought just as fiercely as any man. You've probably heard of the legendary female sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with her record of 309 confirmed enemy kills, a number terrifying enough to make any German infantry unit tremble. Or the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, those girls who made German soldiers so terrified they dubbed them the Night Witches. In the dead of the silent night, they flew their rickety wooden Po-2 biplanes, stealthily cutting their engines to glide in absolute silence like ghosts, suddenly raining bombs down on German positions before any anti-aircraft system could even react. Clearly, the courageous dedication and the massive scale of Soviet women's participation wasn't just a situational fix to compensate for manpower shortages. More than that, they became an invaluable source of strength, contributing to a monumental victory and proving that, when the homeland is in peril, sheer will and bravery are entirely genderless. Steel heavy armor. If you ask any military history enthusiast about World War II tanks, the first names that pop up will undoubtedly be those German armored beasts like the Tiger or the Panther. You have to admit, their design was truly the pinnacle of engineering. With incredibly thick armor and a devastatingly powerful long-barreled 88mm gun, in theory and in head-to-head combat, they were machines that sowed absolute terror. But guys, sometimes perfect is the enemy of effective. Their excessive complexity turned them into high-maintenance divas on the battlefield. They guzzled gas like water, constantly broke down over minor issues, and demanded a rigorous maintenance schedule. The worst part was when they broke down in combat. Repairing them was agonizingly difficult. Just think about it. With such an elaborate manufacturing process, the Germans only managed to churn out about 1,300 Tigers, a pitifully small number, like a drop in the ocean against a front line stretching thousands of kilometers. Conversely, the Russians solved the armored puzzle with a completely different philosophy: simple, pragmatic, and using quantity to make up for quality. That brought about the birth of the legendary T-34 tank. If you crawl inside a T-34, you'd find it unbelievably crude. Comfort was practically zero. The interior was cramped and stiff, and even the exterior steel welds were sloppy. But don't be too quick to judge, because that was intentional crudeness. Its clever sloped armor effectively deflected artillery shells without needing excessively thick steel. The diesel engine inside was both durable and easy to start, despite temperatures plunging tens of degrees below freezing. Most notably, the T-34's wide tracks were a phenomenal salvation when crossing Russia's oceans of mud, the exact places where heavy German tanks frequently got hopelessly stuck. Moreover, because of its incredibly simple construction, tank crews armed with just a few basic tools could fix their own vehicles right in the heat of battle to keep on fighting. And the most crucial factor, that very minimalist design allowed the Soviet Union to mass-produce the T-34 in staggering numbers, reaching tens of thousands of units. Ultimately, in a brutally exhausting war of attrition, the sheer stubbornness, rapid repairability, and overwhelming tidal wave of thousands of T-34s crushed the beautifully crafted but fragile German machines, becoming the decisive steel punch on the armored front. Discipline, spirit, and grit. You see, when discussing the will to fight in desperate situations, many people immediately think of the power of iron discipline. And it's true that on the Eastern Front, both sides enforced incredibly brutal, even ruthless, disciplinary measures against their own troops. The German army had the Gestapo, the SS forces, and field court-martials ready to execute anyone showing signs of defeatism or desertion. On the Soviet side, the Red Army also issued Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, bearing the ironclad message, "Not a step back." They even deployed blocking detachments right behind the front lines, ready to punish anyone who retreated. But guys, the barrel of a military police gun can only force a soldier to stay in the trench. It can't forge a genuine spirit of sacrifice. The core element dictating the endurance of these two armies lay deep within. What was their driving motivation to fight? German soldiers marched thousands of kilometers away from home, fighting for a fanatical ideology and Hitler's ambition to expand their living space. When the army was still winning victory after victory, their spirits were naturally sky high. But when the tide started to turn, especially after the horrifying disaster at Stalingrad, that ideological shell quickly shattered. With death looming in a strange, freezing land, their morale wavered violently, because at the end of the day, they weren't fighting for the survival of their own families. In contrast, the Soviet soldier carried a motivation far grander than anything else. They were fighting on their own motherland. Behind them weren't abstract political concepts, but their parents, their wives and children, and the survival of an entire nation. It was exactly this burning desire to protect their homeland that morphed into an extraordinary endurance that no law could ever enforce. Just take a look at the siege of Leningrad. Isolated for nearly 900 days, drowning in extreme starvation and bombarded day after day, civilians and soldiers alike resiliently held their ground. Or in the industrial cities, they turned every bombed-out factory into a steel fortress, simultaneously fighting off the enemy on the upper floors while continuing to machine every single bullet and assemble gun barrels right in the dark basements below. Clearly, discipline can march a person into battle, but it's the raw power of patriotism and the sheer will to protect one's family that helped the Red Army keep the fires of combat burning until their very last breath. In conclusion, based on the 8 factors above, the Red Army held a decisive advantage on the Eastern Front. Detailed historical sources are linked in the description below. See you guys in the next episode.